2 years ago, when the Attack on Titan manga ended, I wrote the following review. I think the context surrounding the show and how I personally feel about it have changed a good bit since then, but I'd like to read it out as is from that time. Hopefully this will give anime-only watchers perspective on how manga readers felt, as well as give manga readers vindication. However, afterward, I'd like to talk about how the series has changed since then. The Attack on Titan anime has finally ended after 80 plus episodes, and as expected, a ton of people are upset and disappointed. But rather be surprised by that, I'm more surprised that people expected it to be any good in the first place. Having watched Attack on Titan Season 1 not that long after it aired, I found myself excited by the premise and the brutal world depicted. However, almost instantly after the first big fake-out happens and Eren Titan shifts for the first time, while cool, it took me out of any dramatic tension in the narrative, making it obvious that nothing too bad could happen to our main characters between Eren having a power that we have known nothing about until this exact moment, and Armin sitting so perfectly still that none of the Titans decide to eat him. Titan shifting was pretty cool though, so I was somewhat willing to give the show more of a chance to make the conflict between Eren and the Titans interesting now that they have more on their side, but instead it was rewarded with a mostly meandering second half of Season 1 with ups and downs filled with tons of meaningless shock value. I came out at the time overall liking the season, but none of it really stuck with me. It would be many years later when MAPPA continued adapting the series, but it wasn't high on my priorities, so I skipped it. Eventually though, around the time final seasons started airing, the series got to a point that was almost impossible to ignore. More and more often I heard people referring to the show as a modern classic and talking about how genius the writing was. I was hesitant because, unlike so many others, I had no particular reason to believe the show was going to be good. Attack on Titan has a strong premise that brings up tons of interesting ideas, but between the mediocre production values, which honestly were carried by the director, Tetsuro Araki, who is a genius, completely horrifying pacing issues throughout the whole of Season 1, and a lack of any characters really worth thinking about at the time, I was unsure if it was worth continuing. I'd been coming from the mindset of the people who had just watched Season 1 when it aired, and that most people didn't really like the characters particularly or anything like that. I mean, they were cool in concept, but nobody really stuck with them or identified with them particularly, maybe outside of Mikasa, just because she's really aesthetic, I guess. Remember when everyone would just talk about how much they hated Eren, how he was such a simple, one-note character, and that he was just generally obnoxious? Well, turns out all you have to do to make him a character people obsess over is to make him cooler, edgier, and make him the bad guy instead of the good guy. I finally got around to watching, then reading the series all the way through a couple years ago, mostly to see if it truly got better as I was told. Instead of an improving storyline, I sat through 12 episodes of some of the blandest, least memorable writing in modern anime in the form of Season 2. Long stretches of episodes where very little happens outside of confirming the situation and revealing that certainly something is going on behind the scenes that we don't know. Why are there Titans in the walls? What does the pastor know? Who are we fighting against? Better spend half the runtime of every episode hinting that someone else knows the answer to these things and definitely will not be telling us. This kind of mystery box writing is something I find completely intolerable, prolonging all of the interesting plot lines and pushing them forward like a serial procrastinator, keeping the audience hooked on the idea that surely something interesting will happen one day, right? Why did Reiner and Bertolt do these bad things? Find out in Season 3. Oops, I meant Season 3 Part 2. Oops, I meant the finale of the season and the start of the final season. I never had any reason to think that it would get good in the first place other than the premise, which doesn't mean that much in the long run anyways. A story like this needs more to hold your attention than the promise of more. Even the anime understood this to some degree when adapting it, given that they added a scene at the end of Season 2 that only shows up way later just to give us something to chew on, instead of literally nothing. I don't think most people would argue that this is the most perfectly written series of all time. Certainly there are lots of strange details and plot holes, such as anything involving how paths works, but consistently people have said the show, above all else, is entertaining. They point to the fights and the twists, and come out the other end generally feeling validated and spending their time. But here I have to completely disagree. The fights in the series are horrendously boring most of the time, lacking much in the way of any semblance of strategy, much more interested in how many named characters are involved in the fight, rather than how they actually win it. Titan shifters barely ever lose, and everyone comes in at the exact moment they need to in order to save everyone who we've known for longer than 5 minutes of screen time. I've often heard people tell me Season 2 can't be boring, but completely fail to name much in the way of any interesting events that happen or information we learn from the story in those 12 episodes. I've had people tell me that the fight between Eren and Reiner early on is amazing and exciting, which I'd honestly just entirely give credit to for how solid the setup is and how it's executed. The whole setup with Bertolt and Reiner explaining it to him and saying, "Are we gonna do this? Are we gonna do this now?" is really good, and I like that moment. But I immediately have to take those points right back and then some for how boring the whole fight is. It's mostly Eren punching armor and then realizing after like 4 punches that that doesn't work so well, followed by a corny flashback from when they were training, which could have happened, while we were there actually, of remembering that tactics exist actually, and he should probably use them. Didn't we go over this in the first 2 times he fought Annie? Why do we need to figure out how this works again? We're regressing and restating character growth here. Eren uses his new but also not new knowledge of fighting to get close to winning, only for the fight to be solved by Bertolt, making any of the stakes between Eren and Reiner meaningless. This is not entertaining. Speaking of flashbacks, the series is crazy with its flashbacks. You can hardly go half an episode without finding a random flashback to build characterization, as the series struggles to find characters that anyone remembers or cares about. There are so many flashbacks to times in the military training base, as if the author forgot to make anything that happens in those sections tell us anything about the characters in the story, other than Eren and Mikasa. Did anyone remember Ymir beyond her 1 or 2 moments in Season 1, before she became a main focus of Season 2, and are forced to retroactively give her a personality other than wants to fuck Historia? I get we're trying to hide some information from the viewer here, but by doing it we have hidden anything interesting about any character. The characters in this series are so one-note and boring it puts most boring isekais to shame. At least in those, the tropey characters make sense and have defined goals usually, which makes them easy to root for, but half of the cast of Attack on Titan can barely make a decision, let alone have any reasoning for why they do it. All of Season 2 focuses on a wholly uninteresting relationship forming between Historia and Ymir, since they relate to each other a bit, having a similar-ish background, but it's all so surface level that it's hard to remember the development beyond when it happens before we get into Season 3 and crown Historia Queen of the Nation before the story entirely forgets her. After all these issues, it's no wonder that the ending stretches so lackluster, but it didn't start with the last few chapters of the manga or the last couple episodes of the anime. The point I realized how steep of a nosedive in quality we were in for was around when Eren and Zeke go into paths for the first time and comes out with a bunch of ridiculous reveals. The Attack Titan seeing the future inheritors' memories is really stupid. On the upside, it gives Eren, Grisha, and Zeke a bit more of an arc and nuance because Grisha goes from diehard restorationist, which I mean we knew already wasn't really true given how long he lived with his second family, to a guy who cares a bit more about his family. Zeke gets a bit of closure realizing his father wasn't just a monster for no reason, and Eren doubles down on taking everything his own way and being the big bad to do it all. It's pretty stupid though, in that it turns Grisha into a din-do-nuffin. Every character's morally ambiguous choice is just Eren's fault. Grisha had to make a hard choice? No, Eren forced him to, kind of. Even though we already knew what choice Eren would make, and it doesn't really add much to his character. Zeke's mind isn't really changed at all. Instead, we just get tons of added plot holes just for this goofy plotline to flip the blame back and forth without much real meaning. But it's a crazy moment that when it happens and everyone goes, oh my gosh, whoa! But it really doesn't add that much. In fact, I would argue it takes a lot away. Eren wins over the Founder's power instead of Zeke, despite the royal blood difference, because he sympathizes with the real Ymir and wants to end her suffering of 2,000 years. But like, the rumbling and beating all of their enemies doesn't end her suffering of making titans constantly and propping up the bloodline. If anything, Zeke's does. But I guess he appeals to her directly and sympathizes, it just works. It just doesn't super make any sense. I didn't really understand the connotation behind it. As soon as Eren and Zeke have the Founder and the royal blood together, there are roughly 3 courses of action remaining. The euthanasia plan, which Zeke wants, is slightly more humane, but still pretty fucked up, given that you just ruin a lot of people's lives in futures. Rumbling is plan 2, which simply just kills everyone not on Paradis Island, and ends the conflict for now, but leaves the Titans as an eternal problem. Doesn't solve the issue. Needless to say, a horrible option, but at least some kind of almost okay for the Eldians if you only care about them. The third option is to use the rumbling as a sort of deterrence for every other country, similar to the idea of nuclear arms, where no one wants to commit to war because of the looming threat. This option is probably the best of the 3, but doesn't really solve the rampant racism problems in Marley, and won't really improve the quality of life that much around the world. Also, spoilers for real life, but nuclear deterrence kind of doesn't work that well, and becomes a huge issue, leaving the world in a constant state of panic anytime any conflict happens. Anytime a small conflict breaks out, you suddenly have to threaten to either kill everyone or do nothing, and solve no problems, which is not exactly ideal. Paradis Island and the Eldians also would have to worry about espionage and being wary forever of their special titans getting killed or captured or betraying them for other nations, then hurting the rumbling's deterrence and ruining everything. It's a terrible solution, but it's still probably the best one. All 3 of these options are pretty horrible, but the deterrence one again is probably unfortunately the best. And you know what the show goes with? The worst one, because Eren doesn't give a fuck about anyone who isn't an Eldian, because those people are the only people he knows. This is stupid, but at least following through with this, we could maybe see something about what makes its nationalistic ideology bad, or have Eren come to some greater conclusion about his decisions to this point. But no, that wouldn't be a satisfying ending, because it would obviously end horribly for the characters, and the author has written himself into a corner, and we all know it won't happen. So what does happen? Ooh, magic. They stop Eren, and when he dies, the Titan power dies, and everyone who is a Titan turns back. But only after the rumbling has killed 80% of the people on Earth. The idea being that the remnants will gather and rebuild society without prejudice, because there are no longer Titans. What a half-assed in-between. There is no good realistic solution to the Titan problem, so just magic the problem away. To top it all off though, it doesn't work for that long, and war is a cycle, and the Titan power is inherited again at some later time. The end. Certainly, there's a lot to criticize this later stretch for. Stupid assholes like all the Titans going away after Eren dies take away the audience's decision-making power because we aren't playing along with full information. The whims of the story make consequences change on a dime, and suddenly the kill everyone with the rumbling option somehow gets rid of all the Titans and people survive. There's also infinite plot holes with things like the Attack Titans showing the Inheritors' futures. Certainly there is some combination of things. Eren could have shown Grisha to prevent all or most of the tragedies of the series, to get the Founding Titans' power sooner and more productively do things with the royal blood, etc. Those things add to the stupidity, but they don't make it worthless. What makes Attack on Titan worthless for me is that there's really no point to a lot of the story. What message do we get from the story? It leaves us with a very bleak and painfully simplistic message of, damn, war sucks and repeats forever, because that's how the magic power works. But what do we get out of the choices Eren makes? Freedom is good, but he's misguided, so don't be misguided? Don't be self-centered, nationalism and fascism is bad? And yet, it kind of works out for everyone that isn't him just because. So, turns out genocide isn't that bad of an option. Great lesson. We don't get to explore any of Eldia's options well because of twists like the Titan power going away after Eren dies, or unforeseen ways that Paths works, such as the Attack Titan showing the future, Eren suddenly gaining control of Ymir's power, etc. These rob the audience of our knowledge of the setting and ability to engage with the story just so that people can instead be excited and hype over all the surprises and twists for the sake of having twists. I'm not impressed. Some of the individual character arcs are pretty decent, and some of the decision-making of the characters is interesting themselves, but overall, it's nothing I haven't seen done better elsewhere. Eren's characterization at the end is something that people are confused on, and there's basically two explanations for why he would do anything he does at this point. One, he really doesn't care about anyone but the Eldians, and this was the only good way out he could find, to kill everyone from the outside world and have Eldia rule alone. Or two, Eren knew that this was the worst option, but hated playing pacifist and bowing to others, not making enough progress because of the slow rate of negotiation something like the rumbling deterrence plan would have. Therefore he went through with it, hoping that his friends would stop him at some point and pick up the pieces, negotiating from a higher position of power because most of the world outside Paradis Island is dead. I think 2 is the more obvious one by far, as the anime and manga both hint at it, with Eren's friends saying that it's unlike him and not right, etc. He leaves them with a good opportunity to do it, and we know that because he tried to get them to hate him for what would otherwise be no reason, if not because he was trying to push them away to make them want to stop his rumbling plan. We know that Mikasa isn't actually brainwashed to like Eren by her Achaemenid heritage, so Eren simply made that up to make her not like him as much. The only explanation for that scene and beating up Armin is because it makes them more likely to stop him and see him as the bad guy. Basically, Eren at the end of the series pulls off a shitty bargain bin version of the Code Geass ending, placing all the blame on himself in the hopes of uniting the remainder of the world against a common enemy. Chapter 139 confirms this as the intention. This shouldn't really work, but it works a little bit better because they luck out and the magical Titan powers decide to cease after Eren dies. But in the end, Titans are inherited later once again, and the war is a cycle and the world is horrible. What a fantastic message that totally needed over 80 episodes of storytelling to convey poorly. There's no good choices, and if you pick the bad choice, things go badly. More on Eren, he goes through what many have called character assassination in the final chapter. It's definitely not great to have a chapter where the characters are like in the void, clarifying things, but it kind of makes sense when you have a character like Eren who just will not explain himself to others regardless. Either way, having such a character then explain himself for the sake of the audience is still frustrating. To then have Armin forgive and thank him for what he did rather than call him out on it harder is still strange. The line most people complain about is probably the, I want her to think about me even after I'm dead. For another 10 years at least, and all that. I have mixed feelings on this. A good chunk of people thought Eren was cool and even right to some degree, so to them this line makes them mad because he's no longer cool and instead saying some really goofy stuff like this. It's revealing that he has an emotional side, which we could have guessed, but yeah. I don't think that it really makes it bad because obviously Eren isn't cool or right, and even if there's cool moments he has and whatnot sprinkled throughout the story. Even still, this line is very heavy-handed and awkward like I said before. Having a whole, now the characters are in the void, and Eren is exposition dumping through paths so that we know what the characters really think. Moment is kind of just bad writing, I'd say. It's not the worst, but yeah, at least there's like an in-universe explanation that he's doing it through paths, and canonically it's a conversation. Makes it a little bit less bad, but I hesitate to call it good. Other than it being cringe and out of nowhere, this line just feels incorrect to me. I think that Eren cares deeply about Mikasa and all of her friends, but I don't think this is what a good romance looks like, nor do I particularly buy into the idea of Eren reciprocating feelings for Mikasa in the same way that she does to him. It just doesn't really connect for me. Tying this into the bits about Ymir actually loving King Fritz and that's what caused her to suffer, I don't know if they were going for Stockholm Syndrome, which is arguably not even a real thing, or if the idea was just to tie Mikasa's tragic one-sided longing for Eren into a thematic thing with Ymir, but it does not work even a little bit. I do not know how anyone thought this makes sense. It's very strange and only gets stranger the more you think about it. And when you do connect it to Mikasa, it just makes that already bad romance feel even worse. What makes the series so boring and poorly done for me is the poor theming and uninteresting commentary. It certainly won't stick in my mind because of the real lack of meaning. Turns out people generally aren't responsible for what their ancestors did, and categorizing based on that isn't very nice. War sucks and everyone gets hurt, also it's a cycle and nothing ever changes. What are viable solutions for these problems? Who knows? Try killing everyone in the right way and hoping they band together to stop you, but it probably won't work anyways. So no, Attack on Titan was never good in the first place, and I'm not surprised it showed that in its final moments between the lack of well-written characters, figure it out as it goes mystery box storytelling that makes for terrible pacing, and the lack of any real interesting ideas to convey with its nearly 90 episodes. I encourage you in the future to think more about why you're hyped for a show in the first place. If it is only interesting because it continually threatens to get interesting, it never will, and you'll only end up disappointed at all the time you've wasted. This is where my original review ends. My feelings on the show are largely similar. I still don't really like Attack on Titan at all. After having watched the anime's version of the ending, it does improve on a good bit. By feeling more cinematic and stretching those last couple of chapters out, at least feels like it builds more to a proper climax. Thematically, it still feels very unsatisfying to me, and a lot of the characters feel very weird. Armin and Aaron's final conversation lacks much potency for me, given that it ultimately comes to Aaron saying that he has to kill everyone. Then Armin says he has to find another way. Then Aaron says he can't change the future and it has to play out this way so he can't change anything. The idea that the future can't be changed is pretty dumb, but you could justify it that Aaron, as a natural result of who he is, has to make this choice, therefore can't change the future. This is kind of dumb when we see him actually agreeing with Armin, though, that they should search for another way. Is he actually making a choice or not? It robs the narrative of any impact for me, rather than feeling secure that characters are who they are and made their choices for a reason. The power system saps that away just so that Aaron can all at once agree that this was a bad idea, but also that he was forced to do so. There was also what I assume is an intentional reference to Schindler's List in the anime that wasn't present in the manga. In Schindler's List, there's a scene where Nazi troops are taking over a Jewish ghetto, and in the scene it's completely monochrome, save for one girl child wearing a red coat. It takes you out of the scene a bit and makes you focus on her, and only significantly later does the red coat appear again, but this time the girl is dead in a pile of Jewish bodies. The monochrome effect in Schindler's List somewhat pulls you out of the realism and lets you separate from the movie as like a historical event, but then the striking red pulls you back in and attaches you to this one character. Later, when she's dead, it makes it feel all the more real and draws a focus as to how indiscriminate the Nazis were in their genocide. In this ending segment of Attack on Titan, a bunch of people are being pushed off of a cliff and trying to escape the rumbling, and a lady falls off, but someone saves her baby. Her baby is dressed in red, while everyone else is kind of monotone. Immediately this was distracting because I was just extremely surprised, what the fuck? But thinking about it, the idea is basically the same as in Schindler's List, but replace the Nazis with rumbling. I don't know why they decided to do this, as it doesn't have the same effect as in Schindler's List, given that it's very easy to sympathize with all the people dying close up because we see their reactions and expressions and whatnot, but it's also just kind of a pointless callback. We also specifically see that the rumbling stops right before the crowd of people dies, so the baby dressed in red lives, which also kind of defeats the whole point of the callback. It's not necessarily bad, as it's tonally and thematically in line, but I would be lying if I said I thought it was a good choice or really added anything at all. As opposed to the manga reaction, it seems most of the anime-only watchers have enjoyed the ending. I'm sure it's due to its more cinematic feel and smart changing of a couple particularly bad lines as well. I think it's also a bit of a contrarian thing, as anime fans have gotten really tired of hearing from manga readers that the ending is horrible and came in wanting to like it, but also getting a somewhat better version. Either way, I don't particularly think it's good, but the people who came through watching all the other seasons of it are likely invested and like the direction of the story. In my opinion, this ending is pretty much a natural conclusion of the story and reflects its quality. I think the ending isn't great, but that's because I think the show isn't great. We see all the same issues throughout the entire series that I've pointed out in this review already, so I don't really feel more strongly about the ending than I do the rest of it. Honestly, I think people are just kind of sick of hearing about the ending, and to some degree sick of hearing about the show. It's been 2 whole years now since we've been doing this song and dance of how bad the ending is and whether or not the show was always bad. Less of the anime-only watchers are really engaging with the discussion of the ending online than people did when the manga finished, and I think it's because of how tired they are of the discourse, and pretty much that's how I feel about Attack on Titan as a whole. I'm tired of trying to explain my gripes with it to people who don't engage with it that deeply, and I'm tired of thinking about the series only for it to rob me of my engagement with every random twist and turn. I can kind of see a little bit of both sides here. As you can probably tell from the tone of my review when the manga ended, I was generally a little bit more hostile towards the series, and honestly it's kind of an angry review in a way that I kind of dislike for that reason, but at the same time it really is and was how I felt about it, although I feel less harshly now. But generally I am also kind of sick of the discourse. Finally, the series has finished and we can be done with everything. The discourse is going to perpetuate for a while, I'm sure, but hopefully we can move on to bigger and better things. And better shows. See ya!